He was not born in a temple. He did not come from a lineage of priests, nor did he grow up hearing sacred scriptures in his native tongue. He did not choose Ireland. He did not ask to be torn from his home, shackled and sold as human merchandise. He had no army, no wealth, and no position that would make anyone stop and pay attention when he passed by. He did not sit at the table where the empire's great decisions were made. His name did not appear in any important records of his time. He tended sheep. That was what he did, day after day, alone on a cold, damp hillside, far from everything he had ever known. A Romano-British boy, torn from his family while still a teenager, and forced to herd the flocks of a foreign master in a land the Romans called the edge of the known world. And it was there, amidst the cold, the hunger, and the absolute solitude, that something began to take shape within him, something that would change the destiny of an entire nation. His name was Patrick, and the story of his life, told in fragments through his own words that have survived to this day, holds more lessons on perseverance, forgiveness, and divine calling than most biographies of kings and generals. This is not the story of someone born extraordinary. It is the story of someone who was broken, exiled, and enslaved, and who, despite this, or perhaps precisely because of it, became the instrument that would bring faith, literacy, and cultural transformation to an entire people who had previously treated him as property. Let us go back to the beginning, because to understand why Patrick matters, one must understand the brutal world in which he was shaped. Patrick was born around the end of the 4th century in a place that historians still debate, somewhere on the west coast of Roman Britain, possibly near what is now Scotland or Wales. His family was not poor. His father, Calpurnius, was a deacon in the local church and also a Roman civil servant and landowner. His life, until the age of 16, was reasonably comfortable, protected by the structures of the Roman Empire, which, even in decline, still offered a certain degree of security to those who lived under its shadow. But the empire was in retreat. Legions were being withdrawn from Britannia to defend more central territories, leaving the coast exposed to raids by pirates and warriors from across the Irish Sea. And it was during one of these raids that Patrick's life was torn in two. He was 16 years old when Irish warriors raided his family's estate, captured him along with many others, and took him across the sea as a slave. He would never see his parents again. He was sold to a local chieftain in Ireland and began working as a shepherd in the hills, likely in the region we now know as County Mayo or Antrim. For 6 years, he lived in isolation, exposed to cold, hunger, and the humiliation of being treated as an object by people who neither spoke his language nor shared his faith. And it was precisely there, at the lowest point of his existence, that Patrick describes in his own words written decades later in a text titled Confession, having encountered God in a way he had never experienced when he was free and living in comfort at home. He writes that he prayed dozens of times, day and night, in the cold, the snow, and the rain, and that this constant prayer sustained him and transformed him from the inside out. After 6 years of captivity, Patrick describes hearing a voice in a dream saying that a ship was ready to take him back home. He fled the place where he was held, walked about 300 kilometers to the coast, an extraordinary journey for someone with no resources, no map, and no protection, and managed to board a merchant ship. The return journey was not simple. He endured extreme hunger for weeks at sea and later on land, alongside the crew, before finally reuniting with his family in Britannia. He had survived the impossible. Most people, after an experience like that, would have closed that door forever. They would have returned to a comfortable life, avoiding any memory of that place of suffering. But that is not what happened to Patricio. A few years after returning home, he describes having another vision, A man named Victoricus appears in his dream, carrying letters. And on one of these letters is written, "The Voice of the Irish." And as he reads these words, he hears in his imagination the voices of the very people who lived near the forest where he had been a slave, crying out, "We beg you, holy youth, to come and walk among us once more." He describes waking up with a broken heart. The place of his greatest pain had become, in some inexplicable way, the place of his calling. Patrick spent years preparing, studying, being ordained, and being consecrated as a bishop before finally returning to Ireland, not as a slave, but as a missionary. He returned to the very territory where he had once been another man's property, but this time he carried something no one could take from him, a message of liberation to offer an entire people. The Ireland of that time was organized around clans and local kings, with a druidic religious structure deeply rooted in its culture, law, and daily life. It was not an empty territory waiting to be filled. It was a complex society with its own spiritual traditions, its own priests, and its own established ways of understanding the world. It was against this backdrop that Patrick began to preach, traveling from region to region and often facing hostility, threats, and resistance from local kings and druids who viewed him as a dangerous foreigner, someone who threatened to destabilize the existing order. There are many stories associated with Patrick that have accumulated over the centuries, blending historical fact with popular tradition. One of the best known tells of how he climbed to the summit of a mountain, now known as Croagh Patrick, and fasted there for 40 days, praying for the conversion of the Irish people. Another tradition, more symbolic than historical, holds that he drove the snakes from the island, an image many scholars interpret as a metaphor for overcoming ancient religious practices he viewed as spiritually dangerous. But perhaps the most enduring and beloved image is simpler still. It is said that Patrick, attempting to explain the concept of the Trinity, one God in three persons, to people who had never heard the idea, stooped down, picked a common clover growing at his feet, and showed how the three leaves formed a single plant. Simple, direct, something any peasant, any shepherd, any child could understand and carry with them. Let us pause here for a moment and observe what is actually happening in this story. For while the surface is remarkable, there is something even deeper beneath it. The first thing to note is that Patrick was not, by the standards of his time, an obvious candidate for this mission. He himself writes in his confession that he considered himself a man of little education, ashamed of his own writing, and aware that others judged him unprepared. He did not come from a family of great theologians. He had been a slave. And it was precisely this man, scarred, wounded, and lacking impressive credentials, whom God chose to transform the spiritual destiny of an entire nation. This already tells us something about how God's call works. It rarely follows the human logic of merit and credentials. He often chooses the very ones the world would cast aside. The second thing to note is what happened within Patrick during his years of slavery. He does not describe this period merely as senseless suffering. He describes it as the place where his faith, previously inherited and superficial, became personal, alive, and ardent. The pain was not wasted. It was the furnace where something essential was forged within him. The final question this story leaves with the listener is not complicated. It requires neither advanced theological training nor resources that most people lack. The question is simply this: is there a place of pain in your own story that, instead of merely being avoided or forgotten, could become the starting point for serving others who are going through something similar right now? Patrick found his answer on a hillside in Ireland. He returned not as a slave, but as a servant by choice. And what he built there still echoes today, more than 1,500 years later, in every shamrock held up to explain a simple mystery to a child, in every prayer whispered in the cold, and in every person who decides that the site of their deepest wound can still become the place of their greatest contribution. For the God who heard the prayers of a lonely teenager tending sheep on an Irish hillside is the same God who still transforms captivity into a calling and a wound into a